Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we need to talk about emptiness.
Emptiness is a great word for it, yeah.
Right. Not just like the abstract concept of it, but the physical, crushing, geographical reality of it. I want you to picture the Australian outback.
Which is hard to do if you haven't been there.
Exactly. I mean, if you haven't physically stood there, the maps just do not do it justice. We are talking about a landmass that makes up the majority of a continent.
Yeah, it's just an ocean of red dirt and, spinifex and scrub.
And it is so incomprehensibly vast that it genuinely alters your perception of reality. It really does.
Oh, absolutely. The psychological weight of that space, it really cannot be overstated. When you look at the topographical and meteorological data for the Northern Territory, you weren't just looking at a desert.
Right.
You were looking at a sensory deprivation chamber, essentially. You could drive for 10 hours, covering hundreds of kilometers, and the horizon line barely shifts.
It just goes on and on.
It does. And that sheer scale strips away all the usual safety nets of civilization. Out there, the landscape is the dominant force.
Yeah, human presence is just a temporary, highly vulnerable anomaly. I was reading through the geographical surveys of the Stuart Highway to prepare for this, and it's fascinating.
It's a very unique stretch of road.
It really is. It's this single two-lane strip of black asphalt that essentially cuts the Australian continent in half.
Right, running from Darwin in the tropical north all the way down to Port Augusta in the south.
Yeah, which is nearly 3,000 kilometers long. And I want you, listening right now, to put yourself on that highway at night.
It is absolute darkness.
Literally zero light pollution. There are no towns for vast, vast stretches. If you turn off your headlights, the darkness is absolute. It's like a terrestrial black hole.
Yeah, the only thing you can see is just that narrow tunnel of your high beams cutting through the pitch black.
And that isolation, it completely rewrites the social contract, doesn't it?
It does, totally. Because, in a city, if your car breaks down, it's an inconvenience. You call a tow truck.
Right.
On the Stuart Highway at night, a mechanical failure can be a lethal event. The daytime temperatures can soar above 40 degrees Celsius, and then nighttime temperatures in the winter months, like in July, can plummet to near freezing.
Which is terrifying.
So because of that extreme environment, there's this unspoken code among outback travelers. You rely on each other.
You have to.
Exactly. If someone signals that you have a problem, you pull over. That mutual reliance is literally the only way to survive the environment.
Which is the exact psychological lever that was pulled in the case we are going to explore today.
Yeah, it is.
We're going to walk through the 2001 ambush of Peter Falconio and the incomprehensible survival of his partner, Joanne Lees.
It's just a harrowing story.
Truly. We'll examine the source materials, the forensic reports, the high-stakes legal battle over anatomical science versus genetic mathematics.
Which is a fascinating part of this case.
Oh, it really is. And the intense psychological profiling of a killer who essentially used the terrain as a weapon. And we'll also look at the media firestorm that followed.
Because society has a tendency to turn on survivors who don't fit a very narrow, Hollywood-defined script of trauma.
Exactly. And we also have to grapple with the finality of this case. Because the killer, Bradley John Murdoch, he died in palliative care in Alice Springs in July of 2025.
Right, just recently.
Yeah, and he took the exact location of Peter Falconio's remains to his grave.
So we are examining a closed case that still has a massive gaping hole right at the center of it.
It's so frustrating. But to understand how a routine working holiday disintegrated into one of the most exhaustive manhunts in Australian history, we have to look at the timeline of July 14th, 2001.
Let's do it. Looking at the travel logs, Peter Falconio, who was 28, and Joanne Lees, who was 27, they were essentially living the quintessential backpacker dream.
Yeah, a British couple from Yorkshire on a round-the-world trip.
Right, they had already navigated Nepal, Singapore, Thailand, Cambodia, and by the time they reached Australia, they had bought an iconic, bright orange Volkswagen Combi van.
I love those vans, but they have a specific quirk, right?
They do, yeah. So they had traveled up from Sydney through Melbourne and Adelaide, pushing north through the Northern Territory toward Darwin. And that vehicle choice is actually highly relevant to the mechanics of the ambush.
Because of the engine placement.
Exactly. An older VW Combi is air-cooled, with the engine housed in the rear of the vehicle, not the front.
Right.
And they are notoriously temperamental on long Outback journeys. So by the time the sun set on that Saturday evening, they were navigating that oppressive darkness north of Alice Springs.
Approaching a tiny roadhouse outpost called Barrow Creek.
Right.
And in Joanne's witness statements, she notes a very specific detail here. They had stopped at a roadhouse earlier, and she realized a vehicle had been tailing them for a while in the dark.
Which, on a highway like the Stuart, seeing another set of headlights isn't inherently suspicious.
True, there's only one road.
Exactly. But the persistence of this vehicle was unsettling. And around 7:30 p.m., the vehicle finally makes its move.
But it doesn't just overtake them.
No, it pulls alongside the Combi. It's a white Toyota four-wheel drive with a canvas canopy on the back. And the driver does something highly deliberate to establish trust.
He turns on his interior cabin light.
Yes. And that is a very calculated predatory tactic.
Because it makes him visible.
Right. By turning on the interior light, he is attempting to de-escalate the natural fear of a dark vehicle pulling alongside you on a deserted road. He wants them to see his face.
He wants to appear as just a concerned fellow traveler.
Exactly. Joanne describes him as a large man in a black baseball cap with a distinctive, drooping mustache. He looks over at them, gestures frantically, and points toward the rear of their Combi.
Right, he's miming that sparks are shooting out of the exhaust. And if we go back to the mechanics of the Combi, with the engine in the rear, Peter can't see the exhaust from the driver's seat.
He has no way to verify it without stopping.
Exactly. So given the Outback code we just discussed, Peter doesn't second guess it. He pulls the van over onto the dirt shoulder, and the stranger pulls the Toyota up just behind them.
And the sequence of events that follows is rapid and, frankly, devastating.
Yeah.
Peter steps out of the van and walks back to inspect the engine with the stranger. Joanne, assuming they might need to test the engine, slides over the center console into the driver's seat.
So she's ready to help troubleshoot.
Right. The stranger calls out to Peter, asking him to have Joanne rev the engine to see if they can replicate the sparking. So Joanne sits there, foot hovering over the pedal, just waiting for the signal.
And then, instead of a shout from Peter, the silence of the desert is shattered by a single massive sound.
Just a huge bang.
Yeah. In her initial police interviews, Joanne says her brain immediately categorized it as the Combi's engine backfiring.
Which makes perfect sense, honestly.
It totally does. You pull over for an engine problem, you hear a loud pop, your brain naturally connects the two things. But it wasn't a backfire. The acoustic reports from the crime scene reconstruction confirm it was a gunshot.
The psychological shock of that realization is just profound. Because within seconds of that sound, the stranger is at Joanne's window.
And the illusion of the helpful traveler is completely gone.
Totally gone. He is holding a silver handgun.
Uh-huh.
He forces the door open, shoves Joanne violently across the seats into the rear passenger area of the van, and orders her to turn off the engine.
The speed of it all is terrifying.
The speed of the escalation is a hallmark of an experienced predator. He immediately begins to neutralize her ability to fight or flee.
Right. I read the forensic analysis of the restraints he used, and it is terrifyingly premeditated. He didn't just grab a piece of rope he had lying around.
No, he had fashioned homemade handcuffs out of heavy-duty black cable ties.
He wrenched her arms behind her back and cinched the plastic ties around her wrists. He also attempted to bind her ankles and wrap her head in tape to silence her.
Just completely subduing her.
And Joanne fought back with everything she had, kicking and struggling, but the man was overpowering.
Yeah, he was a very large guy. He drags her out of the Combi and forces her toward the back of his Toyota. And when she is shoved into the rear compartment, she makes a crucial observation.
Right, the dog.
Exactly. There is a medium-sized dog in the front cab of the truck.
Which is such a weird detail to process in that moment.
It is. The attacker then closes her in the back and walks away, disappearing into the darkness. And based on the blood evidence later found on the highway, investigators concluded this was the window of time when the attacker was dragging Peter's body off the asphalt and into the scrub to hide it.
And this is where Joanne Lees executes one of the most astonishing escapes in the history of true crime.
It really is incredible.
She was bound, bleeding from a head wound where he struck her, and she's absolutely terrified. But she doesn't freeze.
No, her survival instinct kicks in.
While he is distracted with Peter's body, she manages to maneuver herself out of the back of the Toyota, drops to the dirt, and plunges blindly into the pitch-black Outback scrub.
And to understand the physical toll of what she did next, we really have to examine the environment out there.
Yeah, describe that for us.
Well, the flora along that stretch of the highway is dominated by mulga trees and saltbush. It is dense, it's spiky, and it is entirely unforgiving.
It's not like running through a pine forest.
No, not at all. Joanne pushed herself deep into this brush and basically curled up under a small bush. And remember, the ambient temperature was dropping rapidly toward freezing.
And she was wearing just a t-shirt and light trousers.
Right. And her hands were still tightly bound behind her back, which severely restricts circulation.
I just cannot fathom the sensory horror of those next 5 hours, because if you are sitting in the dark in your house, you can hear a refrigerator hum or cars outside.
There's background noise.
Yeah, but in the Outback, the silence is so heavy it literally rings in your ears. The brush just swallows sound.
It's isolating in a way that's hard to describe.
So Joanne is lying there, hyperventilating, trying to remain completely motionless. And then she hears him come back.
Oh.
She hears the crunch of his boots on the dirt. She sees the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the scrub, slicing through the darkness just feet from where she is hiding.
And she also hears the dog.
Ooh.
Because the attacker released his dog to sweep the area.
Which feels like it should have been the end right there. A logical question is, why didn't the dog track her scent?
It's a miracle it didn't. Experts in canine tracking have noted that the dry, cold, dusty conditions of the Outback night can actually severely inhibit scent pooling.
Really?
Yeah. And furthermore, the strong, pungent, natural oils of the saltbush and the mulga scrub can just overwhelm human scent. It was a microscopic stroke of luck in an otherwise catastrophic situation.
Wow. So the attacker spends hours hunting her. Joanne hears him drive the Toyota up and down the highway. She hears him stop, get out, and search again.
He's relentless.
He is. Finally, well past midnight, the agonizing silence holds. She doesn't hear the engine return, but she is still trapped in those heavy-duty cable ties. The police reports detail how she managed to free her legs and then incredibly contorted her body to pull her bound arms down under her hips, under her feet, and brought them to the front of her body.
That requires immense physical flexibility and a massive surge of adrenaline.
I can't even imagine the pain of that.
I mean, your shoulders would have to practically dislocate. But with her hands now in front of her, she was able to maintain her balance. She crawled and shuffled her way back through the brush, orienting herself toward the faint, flat surface of the Stuart Highway.
Just feeling her way through the dark.
Exactly. And she waited in the darkness until she saw the colossal, sweeping headlights of a road train approaching.
And for context, a road train is a massive semi-truck hauling 3 or 4 full-size trailers.
They're huge.
They are the freight trains of the Outback, and they take hundreds of meters to stop. Joanne stepped out of the scrub and directly into the middle of the highway, raising her bound hands into the high beams.
Which is incredibly brave. She could have been run over.
Easily. But the truck driver, Vince Millar, and his co-driver slammed on the brakes, hauled her into the cab, cut the cable ties, and drove her straight to the Barrow Creek Roadhouse to alert the authorities.
Which initiates the law enforcement response. But when we look at the police logs from that night, we see a cascade of logistical failures driven by the sheer geography of the Northern Territory.
Yeah, it was a mess.
The local police station in the region was massively under-resourced. When officers finally arrived at the scene hours later, they were confronted with a sprawling, contaminated crime scene in the middle of an endless desert.
Reading the initial reports is incredibly frustrating.
It really is.
Because they found a large pool of blood on the asphalt, heavily covered in dirt, meaning the killer had actively tried to scrub or bury the biological evidence.
Right.
They found Joanne's erratic footprints in the dust. And about 80 meters off the highway, hidden deep in the scrub, they found the bright orange combi van.
But they did not find Peter.
No, and they did not find the killer. And the most glaring error in all of this, it took nearly 8 hours from the time Joanne was rescued to properly establish roadblocks on the major arterial routes leading out of the territory.
8 hours. But you have to view that delay through the lens of spatial reality.
How so?
Well, setting up a perimeter in the city means blocking a few intersections. Setting up a perimeter in the Outback means coordinating units to drive 4 or 5 hours just to reach a junction.
Right. The distances are just too bad.
Exactly. And those 8 hours, a vehicle traveling at highway speeds could have crossed into South Australia, Western Australia, or Queensland. The killer had a head start that essentially rendered a physical pursuit impossible.
They were basically chasing a ghost at that point.
The local task force was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of nothingness they had to search.
So for 6 months, the investigation spun its wheels. They had a composite sketch of a man with a mustache. They had a vague description of a white Toyota. But they were looking for a phantom.
Until the leadership changed.
Yes. That changes entirely when Detective Superintendent Colleen Gwynn takes command of the task force. I love digging into how investigators restructure failing operations. Gwynn comes in, looks at this bloated, disorganized team, and aggressively downsizes it.
It was a masterclass in investigative focus, really. Gwynn recognized that massive task forces often suffer from information siloing, where clues just get lost in the administrative noise.
So she cut the dead weight.
She did. She stripped the team down to a tight, highly specialized core. She brought in a veteran detective with a meticulous eye for procedural detail.
Nice.
And a younger investigator who was firmly convinced of Joanne Lee's innocence, which was vital given the public sentiment we'll discuss later.
Right, because everyone was turning on Joanne.
Exactly. And she also brought in a brilliant intelligence analyst capable of sifting through massive data sets.
But before she even deployed them, Gwynn did something incredibly visceral.
She went out there.
She drove out to the crime scene at night. She walked into the scrub, found a salt bush similar to the one Joanne hid under, and just sat there in the pitch black.
That is dedication.
She wanted to physically absorb the terror of that environment, to understand the psychological state Joanne was in, and it grounded her strategy. She knew they weren't dealing with a disorganized opportunist. They were dealing with an apex predator of the Outback.
And that strategic shift led them to focus intently on a man who had already been hovering on the periphery of their intelligence network, probably John Murdoch.
Right.
When you look at Murdoch's profile in the case files, he is the exact inverse of the vulnerable backpacker. He was a diesel mechanic by trade, operating out of Broome in Western Australia.
But that wasn't his real job.
No, his primary income came from running massive quantities of drugs across the unsealed remote dirt tracts of the continent.
The files refer to his skill set as primitive bushcraft, but that term almost sounds too quaint for what he was actually doing.
Sounds like Boy Scouts or something.
Exactly. But we aren't talking about lighting a fire with sticks. We are talking about highly sophisticated off-grid evasion tactics. Murdoch treated the vast emptiness of the Outback as a tactical playground.
He knew how to survive out there indefinitely.
He knew how to navigate the Tanami Desert without relying on the established water bores. He knew how to move across the landscape without leaving a permanent digital or physical footprint.
The intelligence analyst on Gwynn's team documented how Murdoch would constantly alter the physical silhouette of his vehicle to confuse eyewitnesses and law enforcement.
Like changing his truck's appearance.
Constantly. He would manufacture custom bull bars and then swap them out. He would change the canvas canopy to a fiberglass shell and back again.
Wow.
He would alter the mud flaps, change the tires to modify the tread patterns left in the dirt, and he would meticulously scrub the interior of his cabin with harsh chemicals to destroy trace evidence. He was a mechanical chameleon.
So they start building this circumstantial web around him. They link him to the Alice Springs area on the night of the murder through an associate he ran drugs with, a man named James Heppy.
Right.
And they unearthed security footage from a truck stop in Alice Springs captured just hours after the ambush. The footage is incredibly grainy, but it shows a large man buying water and refueling a white Toyota that bears a striking resemblance to the vehicle Joanne described.
But circumstantial evidence and grainy pixels do not secure a murder conviction in a case without a body.
Not a chance.
Gwynn's team knew that Murdoch's bushcraft would provide him with endless alibis regarding his whereabouts in the desert. They needed undeniable, irrefutable scientific proof linking his physical body to the crime scene.
They needed DNA.
He needed DNA.
And this is where the narrative pivots from mechanical evasion to microscopic biology.
Which is such a huge leap.
It is. When the attacker ambushed Joanne, he manhandled her violently. He grabbed her by the shirt, wrestled her out of the van, and shoved her into his truck. Forensic scientists examining Joanne's clothing focused on the back of her t-shirt. Using advanced magnification and chemical regions, they located a minuscule, nearly invisible stain,
Just a tiny smear.
a smear of cellular material transferred during the struggle.
And to appreciate the gravity of this, we really have to look at the mechanics of DNA profiling in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
From that tiny stain, forensic biologists used a process called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR.
I've heard of that. How does it work exactly?
PCR essentially acts as a molecular photocopier. It takes a microscopic trace of DNA, like a few epithelial skin cells left behind in a sweat smear, and amplifies it.
Okay.
It copies the genetic sequence millions of times until there is a large enough sample to analyze. And from that stain on Joanne's shirt, they successfully extracted a complete male DNA profile.
But having a genetic barcode is useless if you don't have a database, Matt.
Exactly. You need someone to compare it to.
And the team suspected Murdoch that they couldn't just walk up and ask him for a cheek swab. He was highly paranoid and deeply embedded in the criminal underworld.
If they tipped their hand without enough evidence to arrest him, he would vanish into the scrub and they would never find him again.
So this necessitated a brilliant tactical maneuver. Gwynne dispatched her young, unassuming female detective to track down Murdoch's estranged brother, Gary.
Just so smart.
Without revealing the full scope of their suspicion, they managed to obtain a DNA sample from Gary. They ran a familial DNA comparison against the profile found on the t-shirt.
And the results?
The results showed a direct, undeniable familial link. It proved that the man who attacked Joanne Lees was an immediate male relative in the Murdoch family line.
Boom. Armed with that intelligence, they just had to wait for Murdoch to surface.
And he eventually did.
He did in South Australia, where he was arrested on completely unrelated, horrific charges involving the abduction and assault of a mother and daughter.
Ugh.
Yeah. But once he was in custody, Northern Territory Police swooped in, executed a warrant, and extracted a direct DNA sample from Bradley John Murdoch.
And the resulting forensic comparison is one of the most definitive moments in Australian legal history.
It's astounding.
When the forensic biologist took the stand during Murdoch's 2005 trial, the mathematics they presented were staggering. They testified that the DNA profile extracted from the stain on Joanne's t-shirt was 150 quadrillion times more likely to belong to Bradley John Murdoch than to any other randomly selected individual on the planet.
150 quadrillion.
For you listening, let's contextualize that number. The global human population is roughly 8 billion. 150 quadrillion isn't just a high probability, it is a statistical absolute.
It's insane.
It is the mathematical equivalent of pointing to a single specific grain of sand on the entire planet. And it didn't stop at the t-shirt.
No, it didn't.
They matched his DNA to trace cells found on the sticky side of the homemade tape he used, on the black cable ties he bound Joanne with, and crucially on the gear stick of Peter's combi van.
And that final detail is the linchpin.
Why is that?
Because finding his DNA on Joanne's clothing proves he assaulted her. Finding his DNA on the combi's gear stick proves he was the one who drove the van 80 meters into the scrub to hide it. It places him inside the victim's vehicle, actively covering up the crime scene.
The scientific net just closed around him completely. But I was reading the trial transcripts, and there is a psychological detail the prosecution presented that is absolutely chilling.
A trophy.
Yes. Gwynne's intelligence analyst had overseen a search of thousands of items seized from Murdoch's properties and vehicles. Hidden among his gear, they found a small, circular fabric hair tie, what some people call a scrunchie or a Mary Jane.
And it was Joanne's.
It was identified as belonging to Joanne Lees. And Murdoch didn't just have it tossed in a drawer. He had it physically wrapped around the harness of his shoulder holster.
That transcends mere evidence. It enters the realm of psychological profiling. In criminal psychology, keeping an item like that is known as retaining a trophy.
Which is horrifying.
It is. It's a tangible token of the event that allows the offender to mentally relive the dominance and control they exerted over the victim. It is an incredibly intimate, disturbing artifact. Court reporters noted that when the prosecution produced the hair tie in the courtroom, Murdoch visibly recoiled. He refused to look at it. He understood that the science had trapped him, but the hair tie exposed the pathology of what he had done.
So faced with this mountain of microscopic evidence, Murdoch's defense team had to mount a counter-narrative, and reading their strategy is almost surreal.
They had to grasp at straws.
They couldn't dispute the science of DNA, so they had to dispute the method of transfer. They proposed that the DNA transfer was entirely innocent and accidental.
Oh.
They argued that on the day of the murder, Murdoch had stopped at a Red Rooster, which is an Australian fast food chain in Alice Springs, to buy chicken. They theorized that Joanne and Peter might have also stopped there, and perhaps Murdoch brushed past Joanne in the crowded restaurant, transferring his sweat onto her shirt.
It was a wildly speculative theory that failed on multiple logical fronts.
Totally.
First of all, it completely failed to explain how his DNA ended up tightly bound inside the adhesive of the tape or on the gear stick of a vehicle he claimed he never entered.
Sweating on someone doesn't transfer DNA under electrical tape.
Exactly. But the most absurd contradiction occurred years later. While serving his life sentence, Murdoch filed a formal complaint regarding his prison meals, demanding a specialized diet.
And his reasoning for this?
He claimed to suffer from a severe, life-threatening biological allergy to chicken.
He literally torpedoed his own multi-million-dollar legal defense just to avoid eating the prison poultry.
It is staggering.
It's almost funny if it weren't so grim. But I want to push back on another major element of the trial, because this is where the law and emerging science really clashed. The prosecution had this rock-solid DNA, but they also brought in that grainy truck stop CCTV footage.
Right, the footage from Alice Springs.
Yeah. They hired an expert, Dr. Maya Sutisno, to perform what she called facial and body mapping. She testified that she could definitively identify the blurry pixels on the screen as Bradley John Murdoch.
Which is highly controversial.
I was looking at the high court appeals on this. Isn't morphological comparison of low-resolution pixels highly subjective? Why would the prosecution risk introducing something so debatable when they already have 150 quadrillion to 1 genetic proof?
That is exactly the argument Murdoch's appellate lawyers made, and it sparked a fascinating, precedent-setting legal battle. You have to remember the context of 2005.
Okay.
Video analytics were rapidly evolving, and prosecutors wanted to use every tool available to paint a visual picture for the jury. Dr. Sutisno used photogrammetry and morphological comparison, essentially measuring the geometry of the face in the pixels and comparing it to Murdoch's face.
But the defense brought in a heavy hitter to dismantle it.
They did.
They put Professor Masij Henneberg, a highly respected anatomist, on the stand. He testified that the resolution of the CCTV was so poor that the pixels bled into one another, distorting the actual anatomical landmarks.
Which is a valid scientific point.
He argued that it is scientifically invalid to make a definitive positive identification from data that degraded.
And the appellate courts ultimately agreed with the defense's underlying scientific premise.
Really?
Yeah. The High Court of Australia eventually ruled that while an expert can testify to observe similarities, such as saying the posture or the general build in the video is consistent with the defendant, they cannot legally state that person is unequivocally the defendant based on facial mapping alone.
That makes sense.
The court recognized that anatomical mapping lacks the universally tested, statistically rigid foundation of genetic DNA analysis. However, and this is the crucial part, the courts upheld Murdoch's murder conviction.
Because the DNA was just too strong.
Exactly. They ruled that while the facial mapping testimony overstepped its scientific bounds, the sheer mathematical weight of the DNA evidence was so overwhelming that the CCTV debate did not alter the fundamental reality of his guilt.
It is a brilliant example of the legal system self-correcting, defining the boundaries of expert testimony. So, Murdoch is convicted. He is sentenced to life in prison. The justice system works. But there is a massive, gaping wound left behind. Because Murdoch refused to confess, Peter Falconio's remains were never located.
And when a highly publicized crime lacks a body, it creates a massive vacuum of truth.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
It sure does.
When law enforcement cannot provide the final chapter of a story, the public will invent one. The aftermath of the trial birthed a secondary nightmare, characterized by wild internet speculation, conspiracy theories, and an intensely cruel media spectacle that targeted the only person left alive to tell the story, Joanne Lees.
We have to unpack what sociologists and media critics in Australia refer to as the Lindy Chamberlain effect.
Let's do that. For listeners unfamiliar with the history, Lindy Chamberlain was an Australian mother whose infant daughter was taken by a dingo in the Outback in 1980.
A famously tragic case.
The public and the media decided that Lindy didn't look sad enough on television. She didn't weep the way they wanted her to. Based almost entirely on her demeanor, she was wrongly convicted of murder and spent years in prison before the biological evidence exonerated her.
And 2 decades later, Joanne Lees was dragged into the exact same psychological meat grinder.
The parallels are deeply unsettling, and they expose a fundamental flaw in how society consumes true crime. Society demands a perfect victim.
We really do.
We expect a victim to be weeping, helpless, and entirely emotionally shattered in public. We want a performance of grief that aligns with Hollywood melodrama, but real neurobiology doesn't work that way.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Looking at Joanne's initial press conferences, you can see the trauma response operating in real time.
Yeah, she was very stoic.
Well, she had just survived being hunted in the freezing scrub by an armed killer. She had suffered a traumatic brain injury from being struck in the head. She had lost her partner. Her brain was completely overloaded.
Right.
And her physiological response was to adopt a flat affect. She was guarded, defensive, and monotone.
From a psychological standpoint, a flat affect is a completely standard survival mechanism. The amygdala, which processes acute fear, essentially hijacks the brain, suppressing the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate outward emotional display.
That's exactly what was happening.
The brain shuts down external emotional expression to conserve energy and protect the psyche from total collapse. Joanne wasn't being cold. She was utilizing every ounce of her psychological energy just to hold herself together.
But the tabloid media didn't consult neurobiologists.
No, they crucified her. At one press briefing, she appeared wearing a T-shirt with the words "cheeky monkey" printed on the front.
Which caused an uproar.
It was likely just the only clean piece of clothing she had access to after days in police questioning. But the tabloids dedicated front pages to analyzing the shirt, her body language, her lack of tears. They framed her survival not as a miracle, but as a suspicious anomaly. Because she didn't cry on cue, the court of public opinion decided she must be complicit.
It is a severe form of victim blaming, masquerading as intuition. The minor inconsistencies in her initial police statements, which, again, are incredibly common when a victim is suffering from sleep deprivation and concussion, were magnified by armchair detectives to suggest a massive cover-up.
It's so unfair.
And that relentless media doubt acted as an incubator for some of the most bizarre conspiracy theories imaginable.
Let's examine the mechanics of those theories because they show how quickly logic degrades when it mixes with suspicion. The most prevalent theory pushed by internet sleuths was the faked death or insurance scam hypothesis.
Right, the dodgy Peter theory.
Yeah. An anonymous individual claiming to be a former coworker of Peter's contacted the press, alleging that Peter was heavily in debt, that his nickname was Dodgy Peter, and that he had masterminded a scheme to fake his own death in the Outback to collect a massive life insurance payout, leaving Joanne to spin a story for the police.
When you subject that theory to even mild scrutiny, it completely disintegrates.
It falls apart instantly.
The police thoroughly audited Peter's financials. There was no massive debt and no exorbitant life insurance policy.
Zero evidence for it.
Furthermore, investigators and journalists who spent time with the Falconio family universally concluded that Peter was exceptionally close to his parents and brothers. The psychological profile simply did not fit a man who would subject his family to decades of agonizing public grief for a payout.
And more importantly, the insurance scam theory requires you to completely ignore the hard biological evidence. How does faking your own death explain Bradley Murdoch's DNA mixed with Joanne's blood on the cable ties?
It doesn't.
The logistics of a British backpacker hiring an Outback drug runner to stage a kidnapping and then vanish are absurd.
Beyond absurd.
But the theories didn't require logic, they just required a willingness to disbelieve Joanne, which leads to the Burke sightings.
The Burke sightings are a classic study in the unreliability of eyewitness memory, specifically a phenomenon known as the misinformation effect.
So what exactly happened in Burke?
Burke is a remote town in New South Wales, roughly 2,000 kilometers away from the Barrow Creek crime scene. Days after the massive media blitz broadcasting Peter's face across every television in the country, 2 witnesses in Burke, Robert Brown and Melissa Kendall, contacted police.
And what did they say?
They claimed they were 200% sure they saw Peter Falconio sitting in their shop casually reading race results in a newspaper.
I find the psychology of this fascinating because they weren't lying. They genuinely believed they saw him.
They did.
But human memory is incredibly malleable. When your brain is saturated with a specific image from the news, it begins to aggressively pattern match. You see a stranger with similar hair or a similar profile, and your brain overwrites the stranger's features with the face you saw on the television.
Exactly. The police, obligated to run down every lead, investigated the Burke sightings extensively. They pulled CCTV, they interviewed locals.
And what did they find?
The sightings yielded absolutely zero corroborating evidence.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most surreal piece of public speculation, the Jellyman theory.
Oh, this one is wild.
This theory actually originated from Vince Miller, the very road train driver who rescued Joanne on the highway. Years after the trial, after being exposed to endless documentaries and media questioning, Miller changed his narrative.
Dramatically.
He claimed that shortly before Joanne stepped out of the scrub, he had driven past a red car parked on the shoulder of the highway. He stated he saw two men holding up a third, limp man between them. He described the limp man as looking like jelly.
The Jellyman?
Yeah. He claimed they threw this jelly man into the red car and sped off into the night. He later extrapolated that the jelly man must have been Peter Falconio being abducted by accomplices.
When you look at the mechanics of memory degradation, this is a textbook example.
But none of that was in his original statement.
Right. Miller had given multiple statements to the police in 2001, none of which mentioned a red car or accomplices. The police investigated the new claims regardless. They found no tire tracks matching a red car, no secondary DNA, no evidence of multiple attackers, the blood pool, the drag marks, the single set of heavy boots in the dirt. All the physical geometry of the crime scene pointed to a lone attacker, Bradley Murdoch.
Miller's brain, after years of processing the trauma and the media circus, had essentially generated a false memory to try and explain the unexplainable absence of Peter's body.
It all circles back to the discomfort of the unknown. People would rather believe in elaborate insurance scams, cross-country escapes, and phantom red cars than accept the terrifyingly simple reality.
Which is what?
A woman survived a random, chaotic act of extreme violence, and the Outback is vast enough to hide a body forever. We have to recenter the narrative on fact.
Yes, absolutely.
Joanne Lees fought off an armed predator, survived 5 freezing hours in the scrub, engineered her own rescue, and provided the testimony that put a killer in a cage. Her resilience is the core truth of this story.
I completely agree. The noise of the internet eventually burns itself out, but the physical reality of the Outback remains. Murdoch was sentenced to life. The legal system secured a conviction. But a conviction is not the same thing as closure.
No, it isn't.
And the law in Australia actually had to evolve to address the specific agony of this kind of unresolved grief.
It did. This case, along with a few other high-profile tragedies, became the catalyst for legislative reform. It directly influenced the implementation of no body, no parole laws across several Australian jurisdictions, including the Northern Territory.
The mechanics of the law are designed as a psychological lever against the convicted. Explain how that mechanism works in practice. Because Murdoch was given a life sentence, but with a non-parole period of 28 years, he theoretically could have applied for release in 2033.
Right. Under standard parole guidelines, a board evaluates a prisoner's behavior and risk to the community. But the no body, no parole legislation legally binds the parole board's hands.
How so?
It dictates that regardless of good behavior, the board must outright refuse to grant parole unless the offender has provided satisfactory, verifiable cooperation with law enforcement to locate the victim's remains.
Oh, wow.
It uses the prisoner's most fundamental desire, the desire for freedom, as a bargaining chip to force a confession.
It is a brilliant piece of legal leverage. But in the case of Bradley John Murdoch, the leverage ultimately failed against his sheer stubbornness.
He never broke.
By 2019, the situation changed dramatically. Murdoch was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The police knew his biological clock was running out, and they intensified their efforts to extract a final confession.
They utilized every psychological tactic available. They appealed to his ego. They appealed to whatever residual shred of humanity he might possess.
They tried everything.
They even offered logistical concessions, proposing to transfer him to a prison facility in Western Australia so he could die closer to his own family in exchange for drawing a map to Peter Falconio.
And he rejected all of it. He maintained his absolute innocence, denying the DNA, denying the trial, denying reality.
Right to the end.
On July 15th, 2025, Bradley Murdoch's body finally gave out. He died in the palliative care wing of the Alice Springs Hospital at the age of 67, and he took the geographical coordinates of Peter Falconio to the grave with him.
The frustration for law enforcement is just palpable. But the investigation into the terrain hasn't stopped. The Northern Territory government still maintains an active $500,000 reward for information leading to the discovery of Peter's remains.
And modern search efforts have largely focused on a geographical nightmare known as the Tanami Track theory.
Yes.
I was looking at satellite imaging of the Tanami Track, and it is daunting. It is an unsealed, deeply corrugated dirt route that branches off the Stuart Highway and cuts directly across the Tanami Desert into Western Australia.
It is one of the most isolated roads on the planet.
Police intelligence indicates this was the primary arterial route Murdoch used for his covert drug runs.
The working hypothesis is that after the murder, Murdoch recognized that burying a body near the Stuart Highway was too risky.
Because of road crews.
Exactly. The ground is hard, and road maintenance crews frequently grade the shoulders. Investigators believe he loaded Peter's body into his Toyota, drove north past Burrow Creek, turned onto the Tanami Track, and drove deep into the desert to one of his established off-grid bush camps.
But searching the Tanami is an exercise in futility. We're talking about a track that spans over 1,000 kilometers. The terrain consists of shifting red sand dunes, dense scrub, and ancient rock formations.
It's just endless.
Trying to find a single burial site out there is like trying to find a specific pebble on the floor of the ocean. The landscape actively works against you, the wind erodes tracks, the flash floods move topsoil, and the earth just settles back into a state of indifference.
Which brings us to the agonizing distinction between legal closure and emotional closure. We discussed Detective Superintendent Colleen Gwynn earlier.
Yes, she was one who downsized the team.
Right. After she took command of the task force, she recognized that the Falconio family was watching their son's tragedy become a global tabloid circus. Gwynn personally flew to England.
Oh, wow.
She sat in the living room of Peter's parents in Yorkshire, drank tea with his mother, Joan Falconio, and made a solemn promise to catch the man responsible.
And strictly speaking, Gwynn executed that promise flawlessly. The task force caught Murdoch. The science proved his guilt. The courts locked him away until he died. Justice, in the eyes of the state, was fully served.
But Gwynn has spoken very candidly about the profound emotional toll the case inflicted on everyone involved. She developed a deep, enduring bond with Joan Falconio.
I can imagine.
For the family, knowing the killer expired on a hospital bed doesn't alleviate the visceral human need for a physical site to mourn. Human beings require rituals to process death. We require graves or ashes or a place to lay flowers.
We need something tangible.
Without the remains, the mourning process is suspended in an agonizing perpetual state of ambiguity. The wound never closes.
It really forces you to confront the dual nature of the Australian outback. It is a place of unparalleled, breathtaking beauty, the oxidized red sand against the blue sky, the clarity of the stars at night. It possesses a majesty that draws adventurers from every corner of the globe.
It's stunning.
But it is also completely, terrifyingly indifferent to human tragedy. It has no memory. It has no conscience. It can swallow a life, absorb the acoustic shockwave of a gunshot, and keep a secret forever. The landscape doesn't care about our legal systems or our grief.
It is a deeply humbling realization. We place so much faith in our technological mastery. We used advanced polymerase chain reaction to amplify microscopic DNA. We used photogrammetry to map pixels.
We threw everything at it.
We used helicopters and databases and legislation to corner the killer and conquer his bushcraft. But despite all of that science, we still haven't conquered the landscape itself. The Outback remains the final undefeated adversary in this investigation.
So, as we wrap up this exploration of the case, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. A provocative question regarding that active $500,000 reward.
The ghost reward.
Right. The locals sometimes refer to it as a ghost reward. The killer is dead. The money remains untouched on the table. Think about the sheer mechanical forces of the desert over decades. The shifting sands, the torrential wet season floods, the relentless wind.
The environment is always changing.
Will the outback eventually yield the truth naturally? Will a random hiker exploring a ridge or an Aboriginal tracker reading the soil, or a massive shift in the dunes finally expose Peter Falconio's remains? Or is the landscape itself the ultimate, unbreakable accomplice to the crime?
It is a haunting prospect. The endless silence of the Stuart Highway holds the answer, but it is not speaking.
A college student attends a party during spring break and vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only scattered clues and conflicting timelines. Next time, we examine the mysterious disappearance of Jesse Ross.